Hello there, it is a Tuesday, which means it's time for another in real life video. This week, we are not taking a general viewer submit question, but as always, feel free to submit one nonetheless. I've got an ever-growing and also ever-shrinking list of general viewer submit questions, so like I said, feel free to submit it, or submit more. And as always, it helps a ton if you include a question mark in the actual question when you leave a comment, because it helps me Control F and look through all of the different comments and whatnot. Anyway, this week we're coming at kind of a little fun, like, rule of thirds almost angle. I don't know, I kind of like it. We're rolling with it, we'll see how it goes. But this week, we're diving headlong into the current discourse while it's still somewhat kind of hot, or at least it's still simmering. I just couldn't help myself. Probably, I feel as though I will be... Okay. If this video, for the most part, if this IRL video, for the most part, stays within the purview of the channel and, like, is, I don't know, 70% or more just regular viewers, right? People who already frequent the channel, who already know, like, my opinions, who already sort of, like, we have an understanding of, like, the way in which, or better yet, who have seen past IRL videos, right? Ones which sort of delve into a genre, right? Specifically taking a look at the... at least my own three sort of specific role-playing game archetypes and, like, subgenres, as it were, that being sort of the sandbox immersive sim role-playing game, the action role-playing game, and the narrative role-playing game, right? And any blends of the two, or of the three, I should say. But hopefully I'll remember to link to that. But this is about some of the, like, more recent, I don't know, points of comparison, talking points of sort of Oblivion and Avowed, or other games as well. Sort of comparing Avowed to other role-playing games that I feel are pretty either disingenuous, either deliberately disingenuous points of comparison, or in the truest sense of the word, like, idiotic. in the truest sense of the definition of the word, idiotic, in the sense that you're ignorant, you're without proper information, or whatever, I would say. And I see very little sort of talking about this in a way in which, I don't know, personally I like, so in that sense this is kind of self-serving in that I want to get out there. But like I said, hopefully this video sort of reaches beyond the purview of my own channel regulars and whatnot, because otherwise I don't think most people will be like, well, yeah, that makes sense, you know? Hopefully we can get folks thinking in sort of a grander way, in sort of maybe a better way, I would argue. But let's start from the top, sort of. I have seen, I think there was at least one decently popular sort of Avowed versus Oblivion video. Now, of course, I absolutely love Oblivion and Elder Scrolls, and I love Bethesda Game Studios games, probably to a degree in which it is unhealthy, right? Probably to, or at the very least, a degree to which I probably ought not to. But also, I really enjoy Avowed. I really enjoy a lot of Obsidian's games. I'm really enjoying playing through Avowed right now. I'm playing through Starfield right now, and I'm quite enjoying that as well. But alas, let's take a step back from there too. We get that out of the way for folks who maybe are unfamiliar with the whole situation here, just in case, right? Not counting on it, but just in case this escapes orbit, as it were. But you have, I think, at least one significant video comparing the two. But also a lot of people just sort of casually off the cuff sort of remarking and thinking about it. A lot of it seemingly loaded by particular individuals with a vested interest in wanting to, like, stamp down what would you say, like contemporary modern games or anything, or like anything new, and sort of like, well, it's just not like they used to make them, right? It's very much like old man yelling at cloud, I guess, you know? But which is a lot coming from me, I guess. But I think a lot of it, I don't, to get ahead of it, I don't blame, I don't like find, I don't have ire, I don't have any reservations of ill will, of ill malcontent toward people who make such assertions, because I don't really think, unless they're doing it maliciously, I don't really think it's their fault. But we'll get to that. I think we'll sum up my thoughts toward the end with that point, right? But we'll just put that out there first and foremost. I don't really think it's folks' fault for it's anybody's fault necessarily for arriving at such a conclusion or wanting to make such a point to sort of look at, right? But in these comparisons, we see stuff like, for instance, I have seen personally, at least, a pretty popular one wherein you go inside of Avowed and Oblivion and you look at like a table with a whole bunch of like cups and bowls and stuff, and there's like fruit in all of them, and then you just swing your weapon at them, right? In Oblivion, of course, the sort of like tableware and the food and everything, it goes flying all over the place. In Avowed, completely static, completely stays still, right? Absolutely zero reactivity. There's other stuff with sort of Avowed's absence of a crime system, whereas Oblivion has a crime system, right? Stuff like that, right? Stuff that I would say is measuring Avowed to Oblivion's subgenre, its type of role-playing game, that being a sandbox, immersive sim-like role-playing game, right? Oblivion has, you know, as does Skyrim, as does, you know, a lot of BGS games, it's kind of their bread and butter. They have a lot of systems in their world made to make the world feel more realized, right? The goal, I would say, of a sort of sandbox, immersive, semi role-playing game in that sense is to put you in the role of someone who exists within this fictional world that you have created, right? So you want, ideally, a whole bunch of systems that make the world feel very realized, right? You want stealth systems, you want crime systems, varying effects with magic that work in different ways that perhaps interact with characters or even the environment in different ways. Not even necessarily magic, because, you know, you could have sci-fi or whatever, right? You could have various building systems, pet systems, any more systems is usually a good thing, right? More different systems. It's nice if those systems have a lot of depth to them and a whole lot to do with them, but generally it is like a case of individually these are not grand or impressive things, but taken together, you know, the sum of the whole is greater than the parts individually, or whatever the idiom is. Thus, like I said, you have a whole bunch of these things, right? You have something like where you shoot an arrow into the sky straight up, and then the arrow eventually arcs back down because it is physically an object rendered within the world, right? This is well within the purview of this sort of sandbox role-playing game, right? Because you're trying to create a world, right? Sort of the impetus for Morrowind, as it were, back in the day, the promise, as it were, was that you would get to live another life, right? But then you've also got narrative role-playing games, something where, branching dialogue is the sort of main aspect that you focus on, where ideally your choices have a ton of impact and there are a ton of different choices all over, and the way in which you develop your character vastly impacts those choices. Like a great example recently of that would probably be Baldur's Gate, or a very distilled version of that, would be something like Disco Elysium, where that's pretty much the main focus of that game, is being a narrative role-playing game. You take on the role of a different character within a specific narrative, right? It's all about your agency within the story, right? And hopefully the story is pretty good, too. But then you also have something like Avowed, which I would say the more and more I play of it, it dips into these other things as many other games do, right? It's rare for these days to have a role-playing game which is focused on just one specific like pillar of what makes a role-playing game. But I would say that for the most part, it seems like an action role-playing game, right? There is a pretty decent focus on, albeit a streamlined, but solid, streamlined but solid, what would you call it? Like gear system, different perks, different ways in which your attributes influence combat. The role in which you are playing, the roles. Let me rephrase it. There are more ways in which you can express and roleplay a different character through combat than perhaps you could through like your narrative choices, or roles in which you could inhabit by just kind of living in the world and existing in that sense. And also, you know, the combat requires a pretty high amount of finesse compared to other things like, you know, Baldur's Gate 3 or even Oblivion or Skyrim, right? Which notoriously have pretty simple bits of combat, right? It's pretty bare bones, pretty simple, right? Thus, I find it odd. I find it peculiar. I find it, I don't know, stupid. I think it's dumb as hell to compare the two, to say, well, Avowed doesn't have this, like, for instance, physics to knocking stuff on a table, when it would be cool if that existed, but it's not really within the realm of thinking like, well, this is kind of what makes or breaks the game, right? We don't necessarily look at other role-playing games, other action role-playing games, I should say, and think like, oh, well, I can't break every single object, right? I don't look at, for instance, Elden Ring, another really good, really strong action role-playing game, probably one of the best in the subgenre. I don't look at that and that I complain, well, maybe this game kind of sucks a butt because I can't open up my inventory, drop a sword on the ground, and then move the sword by holding down a button and see it like physics within the world, right? I can't, here's another good example, right? For instance, well, shoot, I mean, the same thing goes for, you could even say the same thing in, for instance, Baldur's Gate 3, right? You can't quite do it in the same exact way. There's no, like, physics engine rendered out. You shoot an arrow, you can't go back and, like, retrieve the arrow, right? True enough, Baldur's Gate 3, like I said, it's got really, really high production values. It has, like, an immensely enormous budget. But still, you know, if you have your character shoot an arrow into a wooden barrel, you can't, like, retrieve the arrow or whatever. Like you could, for instance, in Oblivion, right? You could physically go and look at that arrow stuck in the barrel and pick it up, and it would be added to your inventory, right? It's because these are games with different, like, design directions. They have different goals. They have different things that they're trying to convey, a different experience that they're trying to make for the player. One wants to have a world which feels very realized. Others are trying to, like, convey a very interesting combat system. Others trying to, like, build out a story which has tons of reactivity and tons of different, what do you call it? Branching paths and all of that, right? For instance, to put the shoe on the other foot, as it were, right? Like I said, I absolutely love Oblivion. I absolutely love Skyrim. We have immense playthroughs of both on the channel, right? Although I would like it, right? Although it would be cool, right? I would not go out of my way to say, like, oh, Skyrim is lacking necessarily it's integral to that experience that Skyrim the same sort of like perk system and combat as exists in Avowed, right? It would be cool if it did have that. But, you know, if you put out another Elder Scrolls game and the combat doesn't feel quite as like snappy, doesn't feel as crunchy as Avowed's does, right? Where you have the ability to like actively parry enemies rather than just holding up a shield and blocking. You have like dodging backward, left and right and all of that. You have like weak points wherein, yeah, that's a big one. In Avowed, for instance, if you aim a ranged weapon, you see a weak point on an enemy. It gets highlighted and you do extra damage there. It would be cool if that existed in Skyrim or in Oblivion, but it doesn't, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the game is worse off for it, right? Because the combat isn't the focus. It's sort of their, I don't know, it's a means to an end. It's like ancillary to the experience, right? The parts as a whole, you know, come together and they form something greater, right? Because it is that sandbox experience, right? The same goes for instance, like, you could even compare stuff within genre, right? Or even, hang on, let's take a step back. Which isn't to say that they couldn't have done the, like, I don't know, body part hits making a difference, right? Have weak points in like, for instance, Skyrim, because you just go back one game from that they had, and Fallout 3 100% had, you know, if you shoot someone in the head, it does a bit more damage. If you shoot someone in the leg, you can slow them down. If you shoot them in the arm, that'll mess up their accuracy or their damage or whatever, right? If they're using melee, right? Sort of the same thing. So that totally exists there, right? You have like limb-based damage that exists within Fallout 3, but they decided from like a direction point of view, well, Skyrim, we don't really want that, right? Same goes for like gratuitous violence and gore, right? You look at Skyrim compared to Fallout 3. If you, no matter how many times you chop a body in Skyrim that you've killed someone, no matter how many times you chop them up, they're like corpse. They're not going to explode into like a gory pile of like giblets and everything, right? Not like they will in Fallout 3. Right? If you keep shooting at a corpse, it is going to continually keep getting mangled and blown up, right? Because that's just part of the direction of it, right? Which this sort of goes to what I was alluding to earlier, where I think a lot of these like misguided points of comparison are sort of all derived from the like genre crisis that exists in video games, right? Wherein a lot of folks, like, even if there are things in which, you know, I would love to see Avowed do whatever better. I would love to see, like, the next Elder Scrolls game do this better or whatever, right? We have, like, a big issue wherein genres are such a mess that people have a difficult time thinking of, like, what's an apt way to sort of critique this game, right? Because to me, it seems like it's such a fool's errand to go and say, like, well, it's important that in Avowed, I have an ammunition counter for my, like, ranged weapon, and when I shoot an arrow into a barrel, I should be able to pick it up. That would be such a waste of development time to prioritize something like that. Like, that doesn't matter at all to that experience. Whereas in something like in Elder Scrolls 6, I would like to see that, because it's sort of within the purview of a sandbox role-playing game, you know? It's kind of important to that experience, to that sort of subgenre, right? And we run into an issue where we really should chill out with like saying, oh, this game is bad because it lacks this specific bit of realism or whatever, right? This like mechanic or whatever, as it were. It doesn't have reactivity here. However, it does have this other reactivity, right? I feel like we're gonna run into a weird messed up issue wherein I don't know, games and stuff could be, the critique of them begins to fall apart if we're looking at two very different types of games and talking about issues in them that are, I don't know, apples and oranges, right? I guess that's the best way to put it. We're comparing apples to oranges here. There's very little point of comparison between some of these grievances, as they were, right? Because they're such different games, right? Like I said, we don't, for instance, we don't look at, if we look at Oblivion, right? There's a spell crafting system in there. That's super cool, right? Not quite as cool as it existed in Morrowind, but maybe a little bit more balanced. Very sad, right? Very sad that it doesn't exist in Skyrim, and was a major sort of point of contention for people, like saying like, oh man, I really, really enjoy Skyrim, but wow, how cool would it have been if they managed to fit in a custom spell crafting system, even if it's unlockable later down the line for the sake of balance or whatever, or they have to put more restrictions on it, once again, for the sake of balance. It's sad there, but we don't look at something like Baldur's Gate 3 or Elden Ring and say, wow, I sure wish I could make my own custom spells. Yeah, I guess it would be cool, but it's not, it's not really within the purview of the game itself. It's not within sort of the design goal. It's not the main objective that it exists there, right? I feel like it feels crucially important, especially if you're in some way levying an intermediate. I won't say amateur, because sure, there should be room for like amateur critique, but if you're levying some form of intermediate critique, right? If you have like some measure of audience and you're levying a critique in that way, I feel like you bear some amount of responsibility to levy the critique with a measure of thought behind it, right? To think like, okay, is this what they were going for in this game? Was this the idea here, what they wanted? Did they achieve that goal? Similarly, what was the budget of it? Like I had mentioned before with Baldur's Gate 3, they sort of famously had a really high amount of production value thanks to a lot of like the unique development behind it. Not just a really high budget thanks to crowdfunding, but they developed it for a very long time and had like tons of feedback in earlier parts of the game that they were able to act on, right? It was incredibly useful. And I feel as if, these are all different points to take into account, right? Budget, which also confers to like, not only what kind of tech, how the size of your team, but also how long that team can even work on the game before you have to get it out the front door. Right, and true enough, you could make arguments like, well, this game had some rocky bits of development or whatever. Do I think it's lesser because I know it didn't have as much development time or whatever because it had like a period of rocky development, it had suffered through like development hell, or do I think that's inexcusable because at the end of the day, I'm still paying them money, right? I think that's kind of like that's within you as a person levying critique, right? That's going to vary between person to person. And ideally, when you do levy your critique, you say as much, right? You say as much, you explain yourself, right? I think that's probably the, fairest way to go about it. But yeah, at the end of the day, that's sort of what I think about. And this isn't just retained to like Avowed and Oblivion specifically. We're seeing like, this is just a most recent one, and I wanted to talk on it here because these are both games I am really enjoying and have played and am currently playing. But like I said, we've seen this before in the past where there are just like really, stupid and disingenuous points of comparison between two different games. Sometimes they're not even in the same genre, let alone subgenre, right? I can't help but think of all of the times that a game has been compared to Red Dead Redemption 2, which might be, until Grand Theft Auto 6 lands, might be the game with the greatest production value of all time, right? Because Rockstar has the resources, has the funding, and frankly, the ability to delay their game, because, especially when it comes to GTA 6, they know that it is going to probably be the biggest thing on the planet when it comes to video games for, I don't know, maybe until they do their next game, right? It's entirely possible. Like, it is a force of nature at this point. It will have impact, and an impact that sends waves rippling throughout everything else, right? And yet we always see various times wherein sort of even on just a tactical level, we see points of comparison of people saying like, well, Red Dead Redemption 2 did it this way. How come new game X or Y isn't doing it, right? How come it ain't doing it? And I feel like it is causing this weird situation where a lot of people are just not fully aware of even basic bits of how games come together, right? I feel like it is folks loving these critiques who are sort of, I don't know, in ignoring that, are sort of, I don't know, wrecking havoc upon the land, as it were, right? It's I don't know, in some senses irresponsible, I would say, right? To sort of, and also, like I said, it's not just Red Dead Redemption, but every time there is a game that seems even somewhat familiar, right, we see it. I can't help but think of people throwing like grenades into water, right? How many times will we see a video comparing like, well, if I throw a grenade in this game into a pool of water and it blows up, how does it look compared to this other game where it blows up in a pool of water? Well, this one doesn't quite look as good. Thus, this game is probably shit, right? I mean, in some cases, that is just used to reinforce, like, okay, this is already kind of a rough game. It's in a rough state. But for other reasons, like, your main point of contention shouldn't be like, well, how do the bullet decals look, Unless it is specifically like a first-person shooter, right? In there, it carries a lot more weight. Right? Whereas in something else, it would be nice if you had it, but it is not of the utmost importance in delivering sort of like their ideal experience, what the developers set out to do, right? I feel as though if we continue down this like train of thought, I don't know, how's it going to be in the future when it comes to this sort of like critiquing in all of that, right? I feel like this is sort of, I don't know, I would go so far as to say a lot of it is born out of perhaps a lazy or malicious sort of level of critique that has risen from the advent of like YouTube and content creators, which are for the most part pretty unchecked, right? Sort of content creators, speaking as a content creator, frequently very unchecked, right? You can get away with saying a lot and pretty much anything, right? It's very difficult to just not get away with stuff, I feel. There's no one sort of critiquing the critiquer and sort of wondering like, well, what's good about this, right? What's your point here? Why is it necessary that this game needs to have, arrows that you can take out of a barrel after you shoot them in there, something along those lines. Yeah, it would be cool if that existed. If, I walk up to a table in Avowed and I punch a whole bunch of bowls and stuff and they all go like flying around and all that. That would be neat, but it's extremely not on my mind when I play the game, right? It's just not something that I really think about. And like I said, I feel like it's somewhat disingenuous to make the point, right? To even attempt to make the point. Either disingenuous, born out of ignorance, or born out of maliciousness, right? An attempt to like garner clicks or whatever, you know? Anyway, hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully this exits sort of the orbit of the channel. I don't expect it to, but it would be nice if it did, because I think that's at the forefront, folks who really probably need to hear it, right? Otherwise, I don't know, it's just going to keep happening. It's just, I guess it's just going to happen, right? And for myself, I don't know, I pretty much just ignore it for the most part, right? This is tying back to something that I mentioned before in a long time ago now in an IRL video. When it comes to people who do like levy critique, who do reviews of anything really, but especially about a hobby that you're particularly interested in or invested in, it helps if you actually know a lot about their taste, right? It helps you determine, well, for instance, I know this person enjoys this type of game, and they like this type of game. I also like this type of game, ergo, I'm probably going to agree with their take here, so I'll try this game, right? Or, this person disliked this game for this reason, right? But they don't normally like this game. Even though I like this person, I'm still going to try the game, right? Because I think I might like it, even though they didn't, right? Something as simple as that, as sort of like understanding the taste of whoever it is that you're watching and understanding sort of the reason why, right? Sort of, I don't know, I guess a lot of it boils back down to like sort of showing your work, as it were, sort of further elaborating and explaining your take, right? Anyway, that ought to do it for this week. Like I said, hopefully it makes sense. I just felt kind of like, I don't know, spurred on by the moment, and it, like I mentioned, this has been going on for quite some time, and I imagine it will continue to do so. This just so happens to be one that is firmly within my wheelhouse in both regards, right? But hopefully it makes sense. All right, until next time, please take care of each other.